Naira Ashford is the ghost of the Blood Moon Court, a woman whose noble name was stripped away, leaving her to work in the shadows of the palace archives. For years she has harbored a desperate hope that Lord Alaric, the highest lord, would restore her status through love. After a cruel setup by the social elite leaves her vulnerable at the masquerade of shadows, Naira is claimed by a kiss she believes belongs to Alaric. In reality, the lips against hers belong to Draven Blood Moon, the formidable Alpha King, who has bound himself to her safety through a secret ancestral oath. As Alaric begins to use Naira's sudden favor for his own political gain, a lethal game of hearts begins. Naira must decide if she belongs with the lord who promises her the past, or the king who has always owned her future. The velvet darkness of the Blood Moon Palace gardens was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the cold, metallic tang of the coming winter. Naira Ashford leaned against the stone balustrade of the east balcony, her breath hitching behind the delicate lace of her masquerade mask. This was the moment. The masquerade of shadows was designed for this. For the blurring of lines, the shedding of reputations, and the courage found in anonymity. Below, the palace ballroom hummed with the muted thrum of a cello and the rhythmic shuffle of the elite. But up here, the air was still and heavy with expectation. She had spent years as a phantom in the archives, a disgraced noblewoman whose father's scandal was a weight she dragged through the marble halls. Lord Alaric, the highest lord of the council, was the only one who had ever looked at her with something other than pity or disgust. Or so she believed. Tonight he had sent a note, unsigned but sealed with the golden wax of his house, asking her to meet him where the moon touched the ivy. A shadow shifted in the peripheral of her vision. Naira's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't turn, she didn't want to break the spell. The presence behind her was immense, radiating a heat that cut through the mountain chill. It was a masculine energy, primal and overwhelming, far more intense than the practiced, courtly charm Alaric usually exuded. She attributed it to the magic of the night, the way the moon supposedly pulled the wolf out of even the most refined lords. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. A large, gloved hand settled on her waist, the touch firm and possessive. Naira let out a soft gasp as she was spun around. The man was a towering silhouette against the silver sky, his face obscured by a mask of jagged obsidian that looked less like lace and more like bone. In the dim light, she saw only the flash of eyes that burned with a terrifying liquid intensity. She reached up, her fingers grazing the fine silk of his doublet. "Alaric." She breathed, the name a plea for the life she desperately wanted back. He didn't correct her. Instead, he moved with a sudden, predatory grace, closing the distance until her back was pressed against the cold stone of the railing. His other hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a hunger that made her knees weak. There was no hesitation, no courtly preamble. When he leaned down, his mouth claimed hers with a devastating force. It wasn't the polite, tentative kiss she had imagined sharing with the highest lord. It was an invasion. It tasted of dark secrets and ancient power, a wildfire that licked through her veins and centered in the very core of her soul. The kiss was desperate, as if he had been starving for her for centuries, yet it was disciplined, the restraint of a man who knew exactly how much power he held. Naira found herself clutching his shoulders, her fingers digging into the heavy fabric of his cape. She felt a spark, a tethering, that she couldn't explain, a sense of belonging that terrified her even as she melted into his embrace. For a moment, the world of social standing and disgraced names vanished. There was only the scent of cedarwood, rain, and a faint, underlying note of something wild, something regal. As abruptly as the kiss had begun, the man pulled away. He lingered for a heartbeat, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ragged. Naira's eyes were closed, her senses reeling. She waited for him to speak, to promise her the world, to tell her that the Ashford name was restored. "The moon suits you, Naira," a deep, gravelly voice vibrated through her, but it was too low, too resonant to be the melodic tenor of Lord Alaric. Before she could open her eyes to look at him, he was gone. A swirl of heavy velvet, the sound of a boots on stone, and then nothing but the wind. "Naira? Is that you?" She jolted, her eyes snapping open. Lord Alaric stepped out from the shadows of the opposite archway, adjusting his golden mask, his expression one of mild confusion. He looked exactly as he always did, handsome, polished, and perfectly composed. "I apologize for the delay," Alaric said, smoothing his tunic. "The council business followed me even to the garden." "Have you been waiting long?" Naira stared at him, her lips still tingling, her heart still racing from a passion Alaric clearly hadn't participated in. She looked toward the empty corner where the obsidian-masked stranger had vanished. A cold realization began to settle in her gut, clashing with the heat still radiating through her body. She had just been kissed with the fervor of a fated mate. But Alaric was just now arriving. Far above, on the highest spire of the palace, a lone figure stood watching the balcony. Draven Bloodmoon, the Alpha King, adjusted his obsidian mask, his jaw set in a hard line. He tasted the jasmine on his lips and felt the weight of the blood oath he had sworn to her father, and the weight of the forbidden love he had just allowed himself to touch. He had saved her from many things in the shadows, but he knew as he watched her speak to his rival, he could never save her from the truth of what he had just stolen. Chapter 1. The dust of the Blood Moon Palace archives was the only thing that felt permanent in Naira Ashford's life. It settled over the leather-bound ledgers and ancient scrolls like a gray shroud, mirroring the way silence had settled over her family's name. In the dim light of the high-vaulted room, Naira dipped her quill into the inkwell, her movements precise and practiced. As an archivist, she was a ghost among ghosts, tasked with cataloging the glory of a pack that considered her lineage a rot to be excised. She turned a page in the ledger, but her eyes didn't track the trade routes or the census numbers. Instead, they drifted to a small hand-drawn sketch tucked into the corner of her desk. It was a likeness of Lord Alaric, the highest lord of the council. He was all gold and sunlight, a stark contrast to the brooding shadows of the Blood Moon Court. To the rest of the world he was a powerful politician. To Naira he was the only ladder left that reached out of the pit her father had dug for them. "If he looks at me at the masquerade," she thought, her heart giving a traitorous flutter, "the rest of them will have to stop looking through me." She began to write not facts of history, but the quiet, desperate yearnings of a girl who had been cold for too long. "I will wear the silver lace. I will stand where the moonlight hits the balcony. And for one night the name Ashford will not be a curse but a promise." Still playing at being a lady, Naira? Or are you simply practicing your forgery skills? The voice was like a jagged piece of glass. Naira didn't need to look up to recognize Lady Celine. The woman was the embodiment of the court's cruelty, draped in silks that cost more than Naira earned in a year. Celine stepped into the pool of light at the desk, followed by two other noblewomen who wore matching expressions of practiced disdain. Before Naira could pull the sketch away, Celine's gloved hand snatched it. The women let out a chorus of sharp melodic laughter that echoed mockingly against the stone walls. "Lord Alaric?" Celine gasped, holding the drawing up as if it were a piece of soiled parchment. "The highest lord wouldn't even use your family's crest to wipe the mud from his boots. You're an archivist, Naira. You belong with the dead things in the dust. Do you honestly think a masquerade mask can hide the scent of failure that clings to you?" Naira stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She kept her chin level, even as her cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the hearth. "The masquerade is open to all of noble birth, Celine. My blood is as old as yours." "Old and soured," Celine hissed, leaning in. She took the sketch and slowly, deliberately, crumpled it into a ball. "Don't bother showing your face tonight. If you do, I'll make sure Alaric knows exactly who is hiding behind the silver lace. A pathetic little rat dreaming of a lion." She tossed the ruined paper at Naira's feet. The girls laughed again, the sound sharp enough to draw blood. Naira felt the familiar, suffocating weight of her status closing in. She wanted to scream, to defend the honor she barely remembered having, but the words died in her throat. Then the laughter stopped. It didn't fade, it was severed. A sudden, heavy stillness descended upon the room, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of cedarwood, rain, and the unmistakable metallic tang of raw power. Naira looked toward the archway. Draven Bloodmoon, the Alpha King, stood in the shadows. He didn't move, he didn't need to. He was a mountain of black leather and obsidian fur, his presence so vast it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. His eyes, dark and unreadable, weren't fixed on the noblewomen. They were locked on Naira. The three girls recoiled, their faces draining of color. In the Blood Moon Court, the king's silence was more terrifying than his roar. He was the one who had signed the decree that stripped the Ashfords of their lands. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. He didn't utter a single word of rebuke. He simply stepped into the room, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically on the stone. As he passed Celine, he didn't even grant her a glance, yet the sheer pressure of his aura forced her to stumble back, her bravado vanishing into a trembling curtsy. Draven stopped a few feet from Naira's desk. He looked down at the crumpled ball of paper on the floor, then back at her. For a heartbeat, the terrifying intensity of his gaze softened into something else. Something ancient and protective, a look that felt like a secret shared in the dark. He reached into the folds of his cloak and produced a small silver invitation, the official pass to the inner sanctum of the masquerade. He placed it silently on her desk, right over the ink-stained ledger. Without a word, the king turned and strode back into the shadows, his cape billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Celine and her cronies didn't wait. They fled the archives in a blur of silk and panicked whispers, leaving Naira alone in the ringing silence. Her heart was no longer fluttering, it was thundering. She looked at the silver invitation, then at the doorway where the Alpha King had vanished. He had saved her, but his protection felt like a brand. Naira reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the silver card. She had been dreaming of a lord's favor, but it was the king's shadow that had finally given her the light. Chapter 2. The Blood Moon Palace was transformed. The masquerade of shadows had turned the familiar cold marble halls into a labyrinth of shifting silks, flickering candlelight, and heavy, intoxicating perfumes. Magic hummed in the air, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to beat in time with the drums of the orchestra. It was a night designed for the shedding of identities, where the lowest servant could brush shoulders with a high lord, provided their mask was fine enough to maintain the illusion. Naira Ashford moved through the crowd like a silver flame. The invitation King Draven had left on her desk felt like a hot coal against her skin, tucked securely into the bodice of her gown. She had spent hours preparing, her fingers trembling as she donned a dress of midnight blue that clung to her curves, layered with a gossamer overlay of silver lace. Her face was hidden behind a mask of delicate filigree, a web of silver that made her green eyes pop with a frantic, nervous energy. For the first time in years, she didn't look like a disgraced archivist. She looked like the noblewoman she was born to be. The ballroom was a sea of anonymity, but her eyes were fixed on one figure. Lord Alaric stood near the grand staircase, his golden mask catching the light. He was surrounded by admirers, his laughter ringing out like a clear bell. He looked every bit the highest lord, radiant, untouchable, and perfect. As the music swelled, a servant in a charcoal livery leaned close to her ear. "The moon touches the ivy, my lady," the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the violins. "The one you seek awaits you on the east balcony." Naira's breath hitched. It was the signal from the note. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she turned away from the shimmering crowd, slipping through the heavy velvet curtains that led to the gardens. The transition from the heat of the ballroom to the crisp mountain air was like a douse of cold water. The gardens were bathed in a spectral silver light, the moon hanging low and heavy in the sky. She hurried along the stone path, the hem of her gown whispering against the gravel. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every rustle of the leaves sounding like a whispered secret. The east balcony was a secluded stone projection overlooking the jagged cliffs of the Blood Moon territory. As she stepped onto the landing, she saw a towering silhouette standing by the balustrade. He was draped in a heavy fur-lined cloak that seemed to swallow the moonlight, his back to her. "Alaric," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread in the night air. The figure stiffened but did not turn. Naira stepped closer, the scent of the man reaching her before his touch did. It wasn't the citrus and spice Alaric usually wore. This scent was deeper, more primal. It smelled of ancient forests, cold rain, and a strange metallic heat that made her wolf-less blood sing with a sudden, inexplicable recognition. "I thought you wouldn't come," she whispered, reaching out to touch the dark velvet of his sleeve. "I thought a girl like me was too far beneath a lord like you." A large hand, clad in black leather, reached out and caught her wrist. The grip wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. With a sudden, fluid motion, the man pulled her forward, spinning her until her back pressed against the cool stone of the railing. The height difference was staggering. He loomed over her, a mountain of shadow and silent power. His mask was a jagged piece of obsidian, more beast than man, and his eyes burned with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. She didn't have time to speak. He cupped her jaw, his leather-clad thumb grazing her lower lip, and then he leaned down. The kiss was an explosion. It wasn't the gentle, courtly affection she had imagined from Alaric. This was a claim. It was raw, possessive, and filled with a desperate underlying hunger that shattered her composure. The world tilted on its axis as his mouth moved against hers, a wildfire that raced through her veins, grounding her and elevating her all at once. For a moment, the shame of her family, the dust of the archives, and the cruelty of the court were burned away. There was only the heat of him, the strength in the arms that wound around her waist, and the intoxicating feeling of being seen, not as a scandal but as a prize. Naira clung to him, her fingers tangling in the fur of his cloak, losing herself in the earth-shattering power of the moment. She felt a tether snap into place, a soul-deep connection she couldn't understand. Just as her mind began to fog with passion, he broke the kiss. He lingered for a second, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in heavy, jagged bursts. He looked like he wanted to say something, a confession, a command, but the sound of voices approaching the garden archway made him freeze. "Naira? Are you out here?" The voice was light, golden, and unmistakably Alaric's. The man in the obsidian mask vanished. He didn't run, he simply melted into the darkness beyond the balcony, leaving Naira breathless and reeling against the stone. "Naira, there you are." Lord Alaric stepped onto the balcony, his golden mask reflecting the moon. He smiled, a charming, easy expression. "I got caught up with the king's guard. Have you been out here long? You look flushed." Naira stared at him, her heart still thundering for the man who had just disappeared. She looked at Alaric's elegant, slender hands, so different from the broad, powerful ones that had just held her. A cold shiver of confusion washed over her, but the lingering heat on her lips was too strong to ignore. She wanted to believe it was him. She needed it to be him. "No," she lied, her voice trembling. "I only just arrived." She allowed Alaric to lead her back toward the light, unaware that from the shadows of the high parapet, the Alpha King watched her go, his obsidian mask cast aside, his dark eyes filled with a terrifying, silent longing. He had stolen a kiss meant for a lord, and in doing so he had started a war for her soul. Chapter 3. The morning after the masquerade of shadows brought a light that felt far too bright for the secrets Naira now carried. Sunlight poured through the high, arched windows of the palace archives, illuminating the dancing dust motes that usually brought her peace. Today, however, they felt like intrusive eyes. Naira's fingers hovered over the spine of a ledger, but her mind was back on that moonlit balcony, trapped in the memory of a kiss that had felt like the earth splitting open beneath her feet. She touched her lips, the ghost of that possessive heat still lingering there. She had spent the night convincing herself that it had been Alaric. It had to be. Who else would have sought her out? Who else would have known she would be waiting where the ivy met the moon? And yet the memory of that scent, cedar and rain, refused to align with the soft floral musk Alaric wore this morning as he approached her desk. "You look as though you're still lost in the music, Naira," Alaric said, his voice a smooth golden chime that broke her reverie. He stood before her, the picture of aristocratic perfection in a cream-colored doublet stitched with gold thread. He wasn't wearing his mask today, and his handsome face was set in a smile that reached his eyes, the kind of smile that had made Naira's heart ache for years. Naira stood quickly, nearly knocking over her inkwell. "Lord Alaric, I didn't expect you to visit the archives so early." Alaric stepped closer, his presence closing the distance between them until he was leaning against the edge of her desk. He looked down at her, his expression softening into something uncharacteristically intimate. "After our encounter on the balcony last night, I could hardly think of anything else. I find myself quite captivated by the woman I found in the shadows." Naira's heart skipped. He was claiming it. He was admitting to the kiss. A wave of relief washed over her, drowning out the nagging whispers of her intuition. "It was more than I expected," she whispered, her cheeks flushing a deep rose. "I wasn't sure if you would truly come." Alaric's eyes flickered, a momentary shadow passing through them that she might have missed if she hadn't been searching his face so intently. He didn't know the specifics of the encounter. He couldn't have because he hadn't been there, but he saw the way she looked at him. He saw the vulnerability, the sudden, desperate hope, and the way she touched her own lips as if they were sacred. He was a man of the council, a master of reading the room and seizing leverage. In that heartbeat, Alaric realized two things. First, that someone else had kissed Naira Ashford on that balcony, and second, that whoever it was had left her so thoroughly undone that she was willing to grant Alaric anything if she believed it had been him. "I have always seen you, Naira," Alaric lied, his voice dropping to a seductive velvet. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of her hand. "Even when the rest of the court turned their backs, I knew the fire that lived inside you. That kiss, it was only the beginning of what I want to offer you." Naira felt a tear prick her eye. This was the restoration she had prayed for. "You would truly stand by an Ashford? Even now?" "I would," Alaric said, though his gaze had already drifted to the heavy, iron-bound books behind her. "But to protect you, to truly bring your family back from the shadows, I need more than just my influence. I need the leverage your father spoke of before he passed. The Ashford Ledger. The one that catalogues the old blood debts of the founding families." Naira froze. The ledger was the only thing her father had left her besides a disgraced name. It was hidden deep within the restricted vaults, protected by a lock that only an Ashford's blood could theoretically trigger. "My father told me that book was never to be opened," she said, her voice small. "He said it was a burden, not a gift." Alaric moved around the desk, placing his hands on her shoulders. He smelled of expensive sandalwood, pleasant, but not the primal forest-scented storm that had clouded her senses the night before. "Your father was protecting you from a world that wasn't ready for your power. But I am here now. With that ledger I can force the council to reinstate your titles. I can make you a lady again, Naira. We can be the power that rules this court." He leaned down, pressing a chaste, dry kiss to her forehead. It felt nothing like the wildfire on the balcony. Felt like a transaction. "Think of it, Naira," he whispered against her skin. "No more dust. No more hiding. Just the two of us and the respect you deserve." Naira looked into his golden eyes, wanting so badly to believe in the dream he was weaving. She didn't see the cold calculation in his stare, nor did she see the dark figure standing in the arched doorway of the upper gallery. Draven Bloodmoon watched from the shadows, his hand gripping the stone railing so hard the rock began to hairline fracture. He had heard every word. He saw the way his rival played upon her heart, using the memory of Draven's own kiss to lure her into a trap. He wanted to descend and tear Alaric away, to tell her that the highest lord was a vulture picking at her bones. But he couldn't. To reveal the truth was to reveal his own weakness, that the Alpha King was fated to a woman the kingdom despised, and that he had broken his own law of silence to claim a single moment of her breath. Instead he stayed in the darkness, his obsidian eyes burning with a silent, murderous vow. If Alaric touched the Ashford blood legacy, Draven would ensure the man never touched anything else again. "I'll think about it," Naira whispered, her voice wavering between hope and a sudden, inexplicable dread. Alaric smiled, the triumphant curve of a hunter who had just felt the trap spring shut. "That's all I ask, my sweet Naira. That's all I ask." Chapter 4. The golden promise Alaric had left behind felt increasingly like a heavy shroud as the days progressed. Naira moved through the archives with a sense of fractured reality, her mind split between the restoration of her name and the haunting, bone-deep memory of the kiss. She had tried to settle into the idea of Alaric as her savior, but every time he touched her hand, the spark was absent, a cold, hollow echo of the fire she had felt on the balcony. The illusion was shattered on a Tuesday morning when the royal seneschal appeared at the archive doors, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. He didn't offer a greeting, only a rolled parchment sealed with the obsidian wax of the king's crest. "By order of His Majesty King Draven Bloodmoon," the seneschal announced. "Your duties in the general archives are suspended. You are to report to the king's private study effective immediately. You will be tasked with the restoration of the First Blood Chronicles." Naira felt the blood drain from her face. The First Blood Chronicles were the most sacred texts in the kingdom, kept in the heart of the Alpha's private sanctum. To be assigned there wasn't just a promotion. It was a summons into the lion's den. She thought of the way Draven had looked at her in the library, that silent, predatory gaze that seemed to peel back her layers until she was nothing but nerves and heartbeat. She gathered her quills and ink with trembling hands, making her way toward the North Tower. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, the scent of the palace changing from the lavender water of the corridors to the sharp, masculine scent of cedar and aged parchment. When she pushed open the heavy oak doors of the king's study, she froze. The room was vast, filled with shelves that climbed toward a vaulted ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long, dancing shadows across the floor. At the center of the room sat a massive desk of dark wood, and behind it sat Draven. He wasn't wearing his crown or his formal capes. He wore a simple black tunic, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of battle. He didn't look up as she entered, his quills scratching rhythmically against a scroll. "Set your things at the small table by the window, Naira," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in her chest, identical to the tone that had whispered her name on the balcony. Naira swallowed hard, her pulse spiking. "Yes, Your Majesty." She moved to the table, her every movement feeling clumsy under the weight of his unspoken presence. For hours, the only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of paper. The proximity was unbearable. Even without looking at him, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, an invisible tether that seemed to pull at her very soul. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the room in bruised purples and deep oranges, the tension reached a breaking point. Naira was working on a particularly fragile page of the Chronicles, her breath held tight, when a drop of ink fell from her quill, threatening to mar the ancient parchment. "Careful," a voice breathed directly behind her ear. She gasped, spinning around. Draven had moved with the silence of a true apex predator. He was standing so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. He reached around her, his large, scarred hand steadying hers. His touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated power that made her vision swim. "The ink is too heavy on your nib," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers. They weren't the cold, obsidian stones she saw in the courtroom. Up close, they were a swirling amber, filled with a raw, repressed longing that made her heart stop. I apologize, sire," she whispered, her voice failing her. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his scent, cedar, rain, and that metallic tang of alpha magic enveloping her. It was the scent from the balcony. It was the man from the kiss. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "You're shaking," Draven noted, his voice dropping to a dangerous velvet caress. He didn't move his hand from hers. His thumb grazed the sensitive skin of her wrist, right over her racing pulse. "Is it fear, Naira? Or is it something else?" She looked up at him, her lips parting as she searched his face. The rugged line of his jaw, the slight curve of his mouth, everything about him called to a part of her she hadn't known existed. She wanted to ask him. She wanted to scream the question, to demand why he was tormenting her while Alaric promised her the world. "I don't know," she breathed. Draven's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a look of such intense hunger that she felt her knees weaken. For a heartbeat, she thought he would lean down and finish what he had started at the masquerade. She wanted him to. She wanted to forget Alaric, forget the Ashford name, and lose herself in the storm of the king. Instead, he abruptly let go, stepping back into the shadows of the room. The loss of his heat felt like a sudden winter. "Continue your work," he commanded, his voice turning back into a wall of ice. "The Chronicles must be finished by the moon's turn. Do not let your distractions ruin the history of this pack." He turned his back to her, returning to his desk, leaving Naira standing in the fading light. Her skin was still humming where he had touched her, and the silence of the study was now filled with a truth she was terrified to acknowledge. She believed the kiss came from the highest lord, but as she watched the king's broad shoulders in the firelight, she realized she had never been more wrong. The shadow she feared was the only light she had ever truly known. Chapter 5. The great hall of the Blood Moon Palace was bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 floating candles for the rite of the first hunt. It was a primal high-stakes evening where the internal politics of the pack were mapped out through ritualized dance and blood offerings. For Naira, it was supposed to be the night Alaric finalized her social resurrection. She stood at the edge of the sunken floor, her silver and blue silks shimmering, feeling the weight of the Alpha King's gaze from his high throne like a physical heat on the back of her neck. Draven had not spoken a word to her since the electric confrontation in his study, but his presence was a constant, suffocating pressure. He sat immobile, a king of stone and shadow, watching the court with a detached lethality that made Naira's pulse trip every time she dared to look his way. "Do not let him intimidate you, Naira," Alaric whispered, stepping to her side. He looked radiant in gold-threaded wool, his smile as effortless as a summer morning. "Tonight we perform the waltz of the lunar bond. Once the council sees us lead the rite, they will have no choice but to accept your return to the inner circle." Naira forced a smile, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. "The ritual is complex, Alaric. Are you sure we're ready?" "I am the highest lord," he teased, though there was a sharp, ambitious glint in his eyes that made her stomach churn. "I remember everything about our connection." The drums began a low, thrumming beat that vibrated through the floorboards. The waltz of the lunar bond was not just a dance. It was a physical reenactment of the moment a wolf claims its mate. It required a specific sequence of touches, the mark of the soul. A sequence of pressure points along the spine and neck that were supposed to mimic the instinctive bite of a true alpha. As Alaric led her to the center of the hall, the court went silent. Naira felt the collective breath of the nobility hitch. She looked up at Alaric, desperate to find the man who had set her soul on fire on the balcony. They began to move. The dance was fast, a whirlwind of spinning silk and rhythmic footwork. Then came the moment of the ritual claim. Alaric reached for her, his hands sliding to her neck to perform the traditional mark. But as his fingers touched her skin, something was fundamentally wrong. In the moonlit darkness of the masquerade, the man who had kissed her had touched her with a precision that was terrifying. He had pressed his thumb against the hollow of her throat in a way that had sent a jolt of pure ancient lightning through her nervous system, a specific pressure that had made her wolf-less heart roar with life. Alaric's touch was fumbled. His fingers were too high, his pressure hesitant and clumsy. He gripped her shoulder instead of the nerve cluster at the base of her skull. To the onlookers it looked like a graceful embrace, but to Naira, it felt like a lie. The soul-deep resonance she expected, the wildfire she remembered so vividly, was utterly absent. It was just a man's hand on her skin, cold and lacking the primal weight of the stranger's touch. Naira stumbled, her foot catching on her hem. Alaric caught her, his smile tightening into a mask of frustration. "Keep up, Naira," he hissed under his breath, his eyes darting toward the council members. She regained her footing, but her mind was reeling. A seed of doubt, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through her hope. The man on the balcony hadn't just kissed her. He had claimed her with an instinctive biological certainty that Alaric clearly didn't possess. She looked past Alaric's shoulder, her eyes landing on the throne. Draven Bloodmoon was leaning forward, his massive hands gripping the obsidian armrests of his chair. His jaw was set, his expression one of suppressed fury. As their eyes met across the crowded hall, Naira felt it, that exact same jolt of lightning, that identical tether pulling at her soul. It was a silent, invisible mark far more potent than the physical one Alaric was currently failing to replicate. The dance ended to polite applause, but the magic was gone for Naira. As Alaric led her away, boasting to a group of lords about their perfect synchronization, Naira looked down at her hands. They were shaking. If Alaric was the one who had kissed her, why did his touch feel like a stranger's? And if he wasn't the one on the balcony, who had been? She looked back at the Alpha King, who was now descending the dais with a predatory grace that made the court part like the Red Sea. He didn't look at Alaric. He looked only at her, his amber eyes burning with the secret truth of a kiss he had no intention of letting her forget. The golden dream Alaric had sold her was beginning to crack, and through the fissures the dark, terrifying reality of the king was starting to bleed through. Chapter 6. The heavy silence of the royal archives felt different now, no longer a sanctuary but a cage of unanswered questions. Naira moved through the stacks of the restricted vault, the silver invitation from the king still tucked like a secret sin against her ribs. Alaric's failure at the ritual dance had left a cold, hollow ache in her chest. Every time she closed her eyes she felt the phantom pressure of the balcony kiss, the specific soul-searing grip on her nape that Alaric's soft hands couldn't replicate. She was supposed to be looking for the Ashford ledger for Alaric, the key to her social resurrection. But as she reached the deepest shelf of the faded family annex, her hand didn't find the ledger. Instead, her fingers brushed against a cylinder of blackened silver, sealed not with wax, but with a drop of dried, dark crimson. It was a blood seal, ancient and volatile. Naira's breath hitched. She knew this casing. It was an Ashford relic, one her father had whispered about on his deathbed, claiming it held the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. With a trembling finger, she pricked her skin on the sharp edge of the seal. The blackened silver hummed, recognizing the iron in her veins, and the cylinder clicked open with the sound of a heartbeat. Inside was a single roll of vellum, yellowed by time and smelling of cedar and old storms. As Naira unfurled it, the handwriting made her knees give way. It wasn't her father's script. It was the jagged, authoritative hand of a king. I, Draven Bloodmoon, Alpha of the Great Pack, do hereby bind my life force to the preservation of the Ashford line. The words blurred before her eyes. She read on, her heart thundering against her ribs. The document wasn't a decree of exile or a record of her father's shame. It was a blood oath, dated the very night her father had been accused of treason. It detailed a secret pact, in exchange for her father's silence regarding a coup within the council. A coup Alaric's own family had spearheaded. The king would officially cast out the Ashfords to protect them from assassination. The daughter, Naira, shall be kept within the palace walls, the scroll continued. Under the guise of a servant, she shall be guarded by my own shadow. Her enemies shall be mine. Her breath shall be bought with my own until the debt of her father's loyalty is satisfied. Naira slumped against the cold stone wall, the vellum clutching to her chest. All those years she had hated Draven Bloodmoon. She had seen him as the executioner of her happiness, the cold tyrant who had stripped her of her gowns and her pride. She had spent a decade pining for Alaric, believing the highest lord was her only hope, while all along, the king had been the one standing between her and the blades of the council. He hadn't ignored her, he had been watching her. He hadn't mocked her, he had been shielding her. Every accidental intervention, every moment of silence in the archives, every shadow that followed her through the dark corridors, it hadn't been luck. It had been him. A terrifying thought struck her, sending a jolt of electricity through her limbs. If the king was the one who had sworn to guard her soul, then the man on the balcony, the one who knew the exact pressure points of her lineage, the one who kissed her with the hunger of a man who had waited 10 years to touch her, could only be one person. You weren't supposed to find that yet. The voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. Naira jumped, the scroll slipping from her fingers. Draven stood at the entrance of the vault, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The flickering torchlight cast his shadow long across the floor, reaching out to touch the hem of her skirt. He didn't look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man possessed by a decade of repressed longing. His amber eyes were fixed on the document at her feet, his jaw tight with a tension that made the very air in the vault feel thick and combustible. You lied to me, Naira whispered, her voice cracking. You let me hate you. You let me believe Alaric was the only one who cared. Draven stepped into the light, his gaze never wavering from hers. Alaric cares for the power your name can bring him. I cared for your life. He moved closer, the scent of cedar and rain, the scent of the kiss, enveloping her. Hatred is a loud emotion, Naira. Kept you sharp. It kept you away from the snakes in the council. If the world knew the Alpha King was fated to the daughter of a traitor, they would have ended you before you reached your 20th year. Fated, she breathed, the word hanging between them like a spark in a powder keg. Draven reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he pulled it back, as if the contact might break them both. The oath was for your father, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. But the kiss was for me. Naira stared at him, the truth finally crashing down. The Golden Lord was a lie, a shallow ambition she had chased because she was afraid of the dark. But the king was the dark, and in the dark she had never been more safe. She looked at his hands, the scarred, powerful hands of the man who had claimed her on the balcony, and realized that her social restoration didn't matter. She didn't need a lord to give her a title. She had a king who had already given her his soul. Chapter 7. The moon was a jagged sliver of bone hanging over the Blood Moon Palace, casting long skeletal shadows through the towering windows of the royal library. Naira sat hunched over a sprawl of old maps and genealogical charts, the flickering light of a single tallow candle the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. The scent of old paper and dust, usually her comfort, now felt stifling, heavy with the weight of the document she had found in the archives. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the blood oath. Every time she breathed, she felt the phantom heat of the Alpha King's gaze. Her mind was a battlefield where the golden image of Alaric was being systematically dismantled by the dark, terrifying reality of Draven Blood Moon. A floorboard groaned at the far end of the hall. It wasn't the sharp rhythmic click of a guard's boot or the light tread of a servant. It was a heavy, deliberate step that resonated through the floor and into her very bones. Naira didn't turn. She knew that presence. It was the storm that had followed her for a decade. Draven moved into the circle of candlelight, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed her desk. He wasn't wearing his royal regalia, just a dark open-collared shirt that revealed the thick column of his neck and the faint silvered edges of scars that spoke of 1,000 battles fought to keep his kingdom and her safe. "The hour is late for research, Naira," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that made the candle flame flicker. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of a map. "Every time I close my eyes, I see things I wasn't meant to know. I see oaths written in blood. I see a king who pretends to be a tyrant while playing the part of a guardian." Draven stepped closer, the heat radiating from him cutting through the library's chill. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, and the proximity was so intense it felt like a physical weight. "I never pretended to be a tyrant. I did what was necessary to ensure the Ashford name wasn't completely erased from history. If that meant you hated me, it was a price I was willing to pay." Naira finally looked up, her green eyes bright with a mixture of anger and a burgeoning, terrifying realization. "And the masquerade? Was that necessary too? To lead me to a balcony, to let me believe the man I thought I loved was finally claiming me? Was it necessary to let Alaric take credit for a kiss that nearly burned me alive?" The air in the library suddenly felt electric, thick with the scent of cedar, rain, and the sharp metallic tang of Draven's rising alpha aura. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his amber eyes swirling with a suppressed primal hunger. "You think I wanted to let him touch you?" Draven's voice dropped to a dangerous velvet snarl. "I watched from the shadows for 10 years. I watched you pine for a man who sees you as a political trophy. I watched you smile at his shallow jokes while I was the one bleeding for your safety. That night on the balcony, it wasn't about necessity. It was about a decade of restraint snapping like a dry twig." Naira's breath hitched. "Then it was you. It was always you." Draven didn't move, but the air between them crackled with the force of his presence. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat the mask of the stoic king shattered. He looked like a man who was starving and had just found the only thing that could save him. "Alaric couldn't kiss you like that in 1,000 lifetimes," Draven whispered, his hand sliding from the chair to the column of her neck, his thumb tracing the exact pressure point he had claimed at the masquerade. "He doesn't know the rhythm of your heart. He doesn't know that when you're nervous, you bite your lip, or that you smell like the jasmine that grows only in the king's private garden." He leaned closer, his chest brushing against her shoulder. The tension was unbearable, a bowstring pulled to the point of breaking. Naira felt her own soul reaching out toward him, the fated bond finally snapping into place with a terrifying absolute certainty. "If I had confessed then," he murmured, his mouth hovering just a breath away from hers, "I would have had to claim you, truly claim you. And the council would have used you to destroy me. I chose your life over my own heart. And now..." Naira breathed, her hands finding the rough fabric of his shirt, her fingers curling into the material as if to anchor herself in the storm. Draven's eyes burned with a lethal, possessive light. "Now Alaric is moving for your family's ledger. He's tired of waiting for a kiss he didn't give. The game is changing, Naira. And I am tired of watching another man pretend to own what has always been mine." He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But as he stood there in the dying candlelight, the truth was finally bare between them. The king was no longer a shadow and the highest lord was no longer a dream. In the silence of the library, Naira realized that the man she had feared was the only man who had ever truly loved her, and the war for her soul had only just begun. Chapter 8. The heavy scent of impending snow hung over the Blood Moon Palace, a cold mirror to the atmosphere within the High Council chamber. Naira stood at the center of the room, her hands folded tightly to hide their tremor. The opulence of the vaulted ceiling and the golden tapestries now felt like the interior of a gilded cage. Standing on the raised dais, Lord Alaric looked down at her, but the warmth she had once imagined in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, jagged desperation. "Members of the council," Alaric's voice rang out, devoid of the melodic charm that had once been Naira's only hope. "I bring before you evidence of a grave transgression. Naira Ashford, in her capacity as archivist, has been caught attempting to steal the restricted blood chronicles, texts that hold the sovereign secrets of our pack's defense." A murmur rippled through the gathered lords. Naira felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at the table in front of Alaric where the Ashford ledger, the very book he had begged her to find, sat in plain view. He hadn't just taken it, he had turned it into a weapon against her. "She intended to sell these secrets to the Frostbite rebels," Alaric continued, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "In my efforts to protect the kingdom, I intercepted her. It pains me, given the affection I harbored for her, but treason cannot be ignored. She is her father's daughter after all. The Ashford rot remains." The betrayal was so absolute it was almost numbing. Alaric was saving himself. He had likely been caught snooping by the king's guard and had decided to throw Naira to the wolves to preserve his own seat on the council. He stood there, the highest lord, looking every bit the savior while he methodically stripped away the last of her dignity. Naira looked toward the obsidian throne. Draven sat motionless, his face an unreadable carving of granite. His eyes were dark, swirling with a storm she couldn't decipher. He didn't speak. He didn't move to defend her. For a terrifying heartbeat, she wondered if the blood oath was just another layer of the lie. "Do you have anything to say, girl?" a senior council member barked. "Or shall we proceed with the sentencing? Exile is too kind for a second Ashford betrayal." Naira looked at Alaric. He gave her a small, pitying tilt of his head, a silent command to accept her fate and die quietly so he could live comfortably. Something inside Naira, something that had been buried under years of shame and the dust of archives, finally snapped. It was a cold, sharp sensation like the first crack of ice on a winter lake. She realized that she had spent her life waiting for a man to give her a voice, only to realize she had been born with one. Affection. Naira's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's tension like a blade. She stepped forward, ignoring the gasps of the nobility. She didn't look at the council, she looked directly at Alaric. "You speak of affection, Lord Alaric, yet you don't even know the color of the ink I use. You speak of protection, yet you didn't even know where the restricted vaults were until you tricked me into showing you." Alaric's smile faltered. "Naira, don't make this more difficult." "I am finished being difficult and I am finished being silent," she shouted, her voice resonating with a power she hadn't known she possessed. "You claim I stole those chronicles? You are the one who begged me for them. You are the one who promised me a title in exchange for blood debts. You are the one who stood on a balcony at the masquerade and took credit for a kiss you were too cowardly to give." The room went deathly silent. Alaric went pale, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the podium. "I am the daughter of a man who gave his silence to protect this throne," Naira said, turning to the council, her head held higher than it had been in a decade. "I am an Ashford, and if my blood is rot, then it is the rot that held the foundations of this palace together while men like Alaric were busy polishing their gold. I did not steal those books. I am their keeper. And I will not be used as a shield for a lord who has no honor." She turned toward the throne, her gaze meeting Draven's. She didn't ask for help. She stood there, a woman without a wolf, yet radiating a primal strength that silenced every lord in the room. Draven slowly stood up. The sheer force of his presence seemed to expand, filling the chamber until it was hard to breathe. He looked at Alaric, then at the ledger, then finally at Naira. A ghost of a smile, dark, proud and lethal, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "The girl has spoken," Draven's voice boomed, a low thunder that promised a reckoning. "And unlike the highest lord, the king has a memory for the truth. Guards, take Lord Alaric into custody. We shall see how his affection holds up under the weight of an alpha's interrogation." As the guards swarmed Alaric, his screams of protest fading into the hallway, Naira felt the heavy weight of her past finally lift. She had found her voice not through a lord's grace but through her own fire. And as Draven descended the steps toward her, his eyes burning with the recognition of an equal, she realized the greatest betrayal wasn't Alaric's. It was the lie she had told herself that she wasn't enough. Chapter 9. The silence that followed Lord Alaric's removal was not the peaceful quiet of the archives, but a heavy, expectant pressure that made the very air in the council chamber hum. Naira stood alone at the center of the hall, her chest heaving, the echoes of her own defiance still ringing against the high stone arches. She had exposed the highest lord, but she was still an Ashford, and the eyes of the remaining council members were sharp with lingering prejudice and a new, unsettling fear. Draven Bloodmoon did not immediately speak. He descended the steps of the dais with a slow, deliberate grace, his heavy black boots thudding rhythmically. Every step seemed to reclaim the room from the chaos Alaric had sown. When he reached the floor, he did not stand at the head of the table. He walked directly to Naira. The councilman shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty," one elder finally ventured, his voice cracking. "The girl's words are compelling, but the lore remains. An Ashford cannot hold influence over the chronicles and the scandal of her family." "The only scandal in this room was the man you allowed to lead you," Draven interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the elder instantly. He turned to face the council, but his hand reached out, firm and possessive, to rest at the small of Naira's back. The heat of his palm through her silk gown was a grounding force, a silent promise that the time for shadows was over. "You speak of laws and bloodlines," Draven continued, his amber eyes sweeping the room with lethal intensity. "But you forget the oldest law of this pack. The law of the fated. For 10 years, I have honored a blood oath to keep this woman safe from the vipers who would have used her to reach me. I watched you mock her. I watched you treat the daughter of a hero like a stain on our history." He turned back to Naira, and for the first time in front of the world, the mask of the stoic tyrant shattered completely. His expression was one of raw, reverent pride. "The masquerade was not just a night of shadows," Draven said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "The kiss shared on that balcony was not a mistake, nor was it meant for a lord who lacks the spine to lead. It was a claim. My claim." A collective gasp went up from the nobility. To claim a fated mate in front of the council was an irreversible act of sovereign will. "Naira Ashford is not a servant, nor is she a ghost of the past," Draven declared, his voice rising like thunder. "She is the woman who held the truth when all of you chose to believe a golden lie. She is the strength that did not break under the weight of your disdain." He reached out, his large, scarred fingers gently cupping her jaw, tilting her face up to his. The scent of cedar and rain, the scent that had haunted her dreams since the balcony, was overwhelming. "You asked why I let you believe it was Alaric," he murmured, loud enough only for her. "It was because I wanted you to choose your own power before you chose mine. I wanted you to see that you were a queen before I ever gave you a crown." Naira felt the last of her doubts dissolve. The archives, the shame, the desperate longing for Alaric's approval, it all felt like a lifetime ago. She looked into Draven's eyes and saw not an executioner, but the partner she had unknowingly waited for in the dark. "I choose the truth," she whispered, her voice steady and clear. "I choose you." Draven's thumb grazed her lower lip, repeating the gesture from the masquerade, before he turned back to the stunned council. "From this day forward, Naira Ashford stands beside me. Not as an archivist but as my Luna. My queen. If any man here objects to her blood, he objects to mine." No one moved. No one dared. The power radiating from the two of them was absolute. The fire of her spirit finally meeting the storm of his strength. Draven led her from the chamber, his hand never leaving hers. They walked through the palace, past the shimmering nobles who now bowed with a reverent fear, and out onto the grand balcony that overlooked the entire Blood Moon kingdom. The snow had begun to fall, dusting the jagged peaks in white, but Naira didn't feel the cold. As they stood together, looking out over the land they would rule as equals, Draven drew her into his arms. He kissed her again, not in the desperate secrecy of the masquerade, but with the slow, deep certainty of a man who had finally brought his heart home. Naira leaned into him, realizing that she had never been weak or invisible. She had simply been waiting for the only man strong enough to truly see her. The Alpha King had claimed her soul in the shadows, but together they would own the light. Thank you for listening to this story. Please tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. Hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have another wonderfully interesting story for you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. God bless you.